and this is Austin Faith Dialogue. It's good business. That's not only a common expression in the world of commerce, it's also the issue which defines the field of business ethics.
This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion in life, produced by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church and your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Today we're pleased to have with us Dr. Floyd S. Brandt, professor in the Graduate School of Business at the University of Texas, and also a noted author and lecturer on business ethics, whose work extends far beyond our locality. We're also privileged to have with us Catherine Bennett Ray of Ray Associates Incorporated, the public management company. We welcome you both to what is obviously a very timely and important subject. And Floyd, I guess I have to begin with the question that I've heard in times past about business ethics. Isn't it an oxymoron?
Well, no, not quite. Business ethics, of course. I don't like the use of the word business in front of any word of ethics. You can range all the way through all sorts of adjectives for it. But no, it's not an oxymoron. It's very real, and it's probably one of the more important considerations in operating with business today, I think.
Mm-hmm. In other words, it's the dimension of that aspect of life like it is of all others.
Yes. It just happens in this case you're concerned with the outcomes and the inputs and outcomes of a business setting. It's how it impinges upon the individuals in that business world. So it's really not that different from other aspects of our lives, the ethical aspects of our lives.
But it comes to public consciousness when you get a case like the Milliken and the Wall Street,
Yes.
the way people were fleeced of billions of dollars, but even close to home in Austin, where people may cut corners. I mean, it's everywhere. And how do you go about, in your teaching and counseling, consulting, how do you go about having people be aware of this and defining the issues on it?
Well, there's always a constant sort of a question: can a corporation, have ethics as such? And of course, a corporation cannot have intent, and consequently, probably as such, does not have ethics. But at the same time, when something goes wrong, trying to make redress from it. And so we often talk about a corporation as though in and of itself as some sort of a separate entity. It has an ethical system. It's really a composite of the ethical system of the values of the people within that organization.
Okay, so that's sort of the focal point, the predominant values that exist within a system.
Usually set by the top person, the head shed, so to speak, really sets the ethical tone for most organizations.
Okay. Well, turning to your work, Catherine, don't you have, with the public agencies that you work with for the most part, do you take a similar approach in regards to the values as the determining factor?
I think values are the foundation. They're the underpinning. We talked earlier about Deming's total quality management and how the corporate culture, and you have corporate culture whether you're in government or business or wherever you're practicing your trade, there's a corporate culture, and that corporate culture is determined by the people at the top in the organization, but it has to be shared by the people at all levels within the organization if you're going to have a cohesive unit, and if the corporation or the government is going to speak with a single voice about anything.
When you were talking to me earlier about this, you used the word dimming. I thought you meant turning the lights down.
Lights down.
But you're actually referring to the name of someone, right?
Right.
Just give us that name and what that whole movement is.
Deming is the person who, in essence, taught the Japanese how to run their corporations more effectively and more efficiently. And now that Japan has become known as being more efficient and more effective than the United States has become very interested in Deming's methodology, which is referred to loosely as total quality management. And there are a lot of other authors that have written on that too. But TQM is kind of a popular buzzword in management.
And somehow you begin with values of the company before you go into the techniques of things.
Right. You have to have those shared values on which you base your major decisions about how you proceed.
I think of the mafia in this regard.
Yes.
I mean, they're very efficient. But if you don't start with the values that is consonant with the needs of the society and morality otherwise, then it runs amok, and I suspect it has a tendency to destroy itself.
That's right, and it's a very consistent set of values imposed and accepted. In fact, an ethical system, in a sense, if you look at it, given what they're trying to accomplish and with the particular values they're operating in a very consistent manner. But I think going back to the Deming, this whole question of corporate culture and putting the values, I like the question sometimes as to whether or not it's possible to produce a high-quality goods in an unethical organization. I suppose it probably is. I think it's very difficult to do because implicit in that is some value about the individuals receiving it in the sense of the responsibility and the honesty and a number of other questions in it. So I think that the organizations, corporations, and I'm encouraged by much of what I see happening now. I think they are beginning to realize that if you're going to produce a top quality product, let alone a top quality organization, you have to go back to that basic premise that our actions are driven by our values. And so before you start to act, you sort of take inventory at least of where our values are and what's driving us in all of this.
I mean, for a business to do that, they don't have a revival meeting, do they? And say you have to be born again as far as your...
Yeah, some of them do.
Huh? Do they?
Maybe
Really?
even IBM.
They bring in some, maybe a guru and have a retreat and everybody sort of, goes on to cloud nine. And I don't advocate that as being the best way of going about it. But that's one of the methods that I see occurring in some regularity, and I suppose Catherine does too. It's as though you can bring in the outside revivalists, and he comes in and fires everyone up and away they go with it. That's not the way it's done, I think. So.
Well, how have you seen it done?
Well, I've seen it done in a lot of different ways. I think the main thing we have to recognize is that to change a corporate culture, if those values are not shared, if the people at the top don't have strong ethical values, and those values are not shared by the people within the organization at all different levels, then you're not going to be able to change that, or at least you're not going to be able to change that with any permanency, and you can't change it very quickly regardless.
Okay.
Corporate culture takes, 20 years to establish.
Well, one thing we have to change right now is in terms of a break that
Okay.
comes in the middle of our program here, but we will be right back to talk more about business ethics. Stay tuned.
Serving Austin means serving you. Each day, Austin Metropolitan Ministries is religion in action, providing affordable housing, caring for the elderly, marching against hunger, and much more. AMM promotes understanding, cooperation, and social involvement. So when we ask for your help, we're really asking to help you, Austin. To find out how you can help Austin Metropolitan Ministries help Austin through its member organizations, just call 472-7627.
Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue. Our guests are Professor Floyd S. Brandt of the University of Texas and Catherine Bennett Ray of Ray Associates. And as we move into this segment, I would like to just share with you and our viewers a quote from the Wall Street Journal that talks about more big businesses set up ethics offices and indicated that 5 years ago, few corporations had ethics officers. But 15 to 20% of big companies have them now, according to this report. They cite Textron's Bell Helicopter as an example of one who has an ethics officer from reaching from lower levels to higher levels in the work. And then they quote someone from Colorado Springs, Colorado Center for Creative Leadership, a person there who says ethics officers are a terrible idea. You're giving ownership of the corporate conscience to one person, and it becomes that person's responsibility to catch ethics violations. The chief executive officer should be responsible for imposing values throughout a company. How do you respond to that, Catherine?
I agree with the latter. And I think not only, I think the chief executive officer has to be the lead and impose the underpinnings and the foundation, but then I think each of us within every organization has to be personally responsible. And I think if you have an ethics officer, it might tend to make some people think that they don't have to be personally responsible and accountable for their own ethics in their performance in the corporation.
How do you respond to
I
it?
would tend to agree with that. I think there is a place, of course, for any kind of educational awareness kind of activity, but not a responsibility-seeking, because it's much like our problem with whether or not to teach an ethics course in a business school. You know, the way the ethics should be taught is in every course taught. It should be a component. And so we teach a course in ethics, an elective course, and consequently the students, the faculty and the students get a feeling, well, that's taken care of in that unit there. And
I mean, marketing would have its ethical dimension,
That's
production
true.
would have its.
And that's the way it should be taught. We've not been able to do it very well that way. So there's a comparable thing. And if there's a feeling, for example, that somehow or other you've moved this responsibility, you've now discovered that great cloud of ethicists in the sky who can answer the questions in a legal sense, then I think there's some real risk in this.
Okay, well, I'd like to raise with you what is, as I've seen people struggle to make ends meet in business, in a tough economy. And if it's a question of, you know, staying on the straight and narrow as far as usual ethical practices and cutting corners in order to survive, how do you counsel people when it's oftentimes not a matter of case or black or white, but of gray? That if it's that kind of competitive environment where they feel they have to cheat in order to make it.
I'm not sure it's really that gray. I think ethics tend to be more black and white than most of us want to admit or will admit on a regular basis. I think that you do make choices. You make choices every day, but I think if you make the shortcut choices, you're making decisions that are only going to help you in the short term, and in the long term, you'll regret having made those decisions.
Yes, sometimes it's hard to explain because they do see the survival. And I think there's a capacity also for paralysis that can take place. In other words, it's possible for an individual to become so concerned with this that they really can't act. But I think there's no other answer. I'm thinking of a particular case where, you know, an individual customer comes to a supplier and says, you know, I'd like to have $300 a week, you know, in cash. They never take checks in this sort of activity. And the response for the businessman, this is a survival mode. And he says to himself, finally, it doesn't matter. Once I was asked, I probably lost the business because somebody else down the line is going to do something else, and it's a downhill slope from there anyway. So I don't think there's any choice in what to be done, particularly if you look into the future a little bit.
Well, the old adage that honesty is the best policy is what you're saying is based on reality. It's not
Still
just
correct.
That's right. And that's the way we build the trust in our business organizations. When without that trust, they don't function.
That's right. At least not in the long term.
And in a nonprofit sector like the government, that
Right.
you work with those folks.
Right.
What are the ethical dilemmas there?
Oh, constant ethical dilemmas. Ethics and politics, I think, are very closely interwoven. Governments are always facing ethical decisions. What do we do with the garbage? Do we make sure that hazardous waste isn't dumped into the sewage system? There are all kinds of ethical decisions, a lot of them impacting the environment, but a lot of them affecting taxes and everything else. So,
I see Austin as being unique in terms of having the state government here, the center of that, and also the environmental battles that rage between those folks and the developers, and that's Austin in a fairly, I would say, distinctive way in
Right.
how the ethics present themselves here.
You know, Richard, I think in the midst of all of this, there's a common problem, I think, in all of our organizations, and I like to refer to it as a problem of kind of a moral muteness, a muteness about these issues. The organizations, it seems to me, that encounter real problems are those who don't talk about them. And again, we're talking about the chief executive officer or the lead people, setting up an environment where people can talk about this. You know, I have never met anyone who set out to be unethical in the business world. It seems to happen a little bit at a time. And it's
Sort of
only
like
by
setting out
this,
to be average.
and it's only by sort of an ongoing dialogue in which these issues are discussed that an organization begins to build that common set of values that lets them deal with these crises and so on. So I think there's a lot of muteness. You leave it in the parking lot.
Say the word again that you're just saying.
More muteness.
Mutinous. Oh, muteness.
Muteness.
A quietness.
Quietness. They're
Yeah.
just not talking about it.
Yeah, kind of a conspiracy of silence.
Well, it's and organizations impose this. We just don't talk about things like that here. And
All right.
those are the organizations, I think, that are at real risk when something does happen.
So when you
I think he's
consult with
right.
businesses, you say, get the communications flow going.
We get that very sophisticated management process known as talking to each other.
Yeah. Catherine, you were going to add to that.
Well, I think if the more closed the environment, the corporate environment, the more likely there is to be a problem with ethics, or the more likely there is to be an ethical problem that could be covered up. If everybody is constantly in communication and sharing the work and working in teams and all that, then it's a lot harder to do something unethical and have people not know about it.
Well, you know, one thing, in the time that we have left, and because this is an interfaith, ecumenically sponsored program, I think we need to think about the religious community and its relationship to business ethics. And just open-ended question in that regard. What's been your perception of that need and experience of how that need has been met?
I think there's a great need out there for the religious community to step up to the plate and take the lead, to be the leader, to be the vanguard from the pulpit, from Sunday school classes, from evening classes, all sorts of educational opportunities with the congregations, to educate their people about ethical concerns and issues through everyday life. I mean, all you have to do is read the newspaper every day and you can find 2 or 3 current events that you could address in your sermon or your classes.
Teaching and preaching, then, is
Right.
part of that, yeah.
And I think there's some kind of a process that begins to say that to bring these issues. I currently am teaching some adult Sunday school class, and the last class was almost totally in the question of bribery. Well, it was interesting to see how trying to make the transition, and it's not easy for a lot of people to make this transition from the Bible, from the religious teachings to this workplace.
Now, there's almost a schizophrenia there, isn't there?
And so that doesn't quite
the Bible
fit.
over here and the world over here sort of thing.
Because you've got the question of individual unselfishness and justice and a business person trying to merge these two things. And so I think that if the churches, if I could plug in a kind of a private line, it would probably be some kind of an ongoing business person session in which they talked about front page kinds of issues and then tried to bring the biblical teachings to it.
That rings a bell because in the church that I've served in the past, we had what was a business ethics breakfast in which people would come together on a regular basis, and the focal point were case studies
Yes.
that people in our particular congregation at that time they were wrestling with. You know, a manager is called to do something that's shady from higher ups, gets caught in the middle, and he wants help on that.
Right.
And he doesn't want to just flip to, you know, Revelations 3:12 to see if there's an answer there.
Yes.
He's assuming the Bible isn't a textbook sort of thing in this regard. But if he were in your group, how would you counsel him?
Well, how would I counsel him? Certainly I'd have him talking with the people around who'd been in similar situations. And one thing I would say to him very pointedly is if you're absolutely certain you've got the final answer, you may be in trouble. Because what you've got to do, you've got to maintain that constant tension, that choice. And to say that there's always a specific answer to every one is just not true. And consequently, you get in organizations, for example, where there's a great fear of failure. If you make a mistake, you're gone. That's where you really begin to get this quietness. It's very difficult to talk about moral issues in an environment where you're afraid if you make a mistake, you're gone.
Right.
Because it's a total environment situation.
I think churches have an added responsibility, though. I mean, I'm a believer that churches also have a responsibility for correct, ethical, political, and social action. Because I think if you don't do some sort of action, if you're not involved in some sort of activity that speaks to what it is that you're saying you believe and what it is you're saying you practice, then you run the risk of your actions speaking so loudly or your inaction speaking so loudly that
Okay.
people can't hear what you're saying.
Well, what's an example of what you're saying?
Well, one example I think is your Metropolitan Ministries. Another example is Austin Interfaith. I've been real active in that, and we work for social justice and helping to empower people who are unempowered in the community to take action when corporations or the government or somebody takes an action against their community that is unjust.
Aha, so it's not just teaching and preaching, it's acting.
I think it is.
Yes, we have an ethical obligation to do something, to make something happen. And I think that's and this process, again, I can't emphasize it enough. It is dealt with by people talking to each other. And some of the boards I sat on, one of my questions I'll ask almost every board, not every board session, but many of them, is there anything else we should be talking about? And it's amazing. Now, they're not dumping things down the sewer or doing things like that, but the little issues of how do you deal with this sales transaction or with this discharge of somebody's claim. And people want to talk about this because they've all got the questions. And it's the responsibility of our organizations to provide an environment that does not encourage a mutinous in this.
Yeah, and one of the conspiracies of silence in the past that is increasingly less so has to do with sexual harassment in the marketplace. I mean, that's
Big issue.
That's a big issue. Where do you run across that
Big
today?
issue in fire departments.
Fire department.
And police departments. It's a big issue for cities and counties, but it's especially prevalent, and there's a lot of lawsuits in fire departments and police departments, typically male environments, where females now have broken into that work environment. And you have things like posters of nudie girls on the walls in the firehouses and comments being made because the people in the firehouse are used to being able to say whatever they think or want to their buddy who works side by side with them, and so there's a lot of that.
And but I think there's an encouraging amount of change taking place. The Snicker index is dropping very rapidly in these organizations as they learn that organizations are serious about this.
And yet, in the midst of all of this awareness, after the Anita Hill, testimony that raised this to public conscience, then the tailgate came along. I mean, it was just like nothing had ever happened to make people aware of that. And so it's not past us by any means.
No, it's not past, but it's certainly the awareness of it is moving along very rapidly.
Yeah.
But the tailgate situation was one that was a continuation of something that had been happening for years and years as it finally evolved. So it wasn't a new incident.
Right. Well, I think that one of the things that's as a focal point for our religious reflections, I know of a ministry that was started in a shopping center. It was called Agora, which had from the Greek word for market. And a minister was placed in an office, and his job was to interact with all of the business forces that were going on in that locality. And one of the businesses was one of the Fortune 500, and he would be called in to visit with people there about issues like you were talking about, hiring and firing, and whether you could make policies that were consonant, not just legally, but ethically. And then he'd wait tables. And he would go into a restaurant, and the management there would let him take his place along with the other people that were serving to see what it was like there, and he became almost a counselor to people at various levels. And I thought that would take an award for one of the more imaginative ways to relate
I think so.
faith community to the market.
And you know, the old Chicago City Missionary Society, and that
Industrial Foundation.
and that Bill
Industrial
Coy
areas,
in
yeah.
Chicago started,
Right.
where he had actually teaching business cases on the commuter trains going to and from Chicago to the business executives on those trains in the morning, and ethics and religion, mixing these all together. I guess it goes back to Paul. Paul was doing some of this sort of thing too, wasn't he, with his sort of tent-making activities.
Well, it's not just the big issues like you were talking about. It's even little issues like, do you take your family out to eat and put it on the company?
Oh, uh-huh.
I mean, there are all kinds of, do you fill up your personal car on the corporate card? You know, we uncovered some things like that one time in working for a client where the was a manager of an association, and he was in effect living off of the association, putting all kinds of personal expenses on the corporate card. So there are all kinds of issues that are just day-to-day issues that affect you. And sometimes people get to a point where they become immune to them. They don't even realize that they're making ethical decisions there.
I wonder, too, if you couldn't come up with a kind of updated 10 Commandments as far as modern business was concerned that would translate, you know, thou shalt not steal into forms that people would understand very readily what that meant.
I'd always be inclined to form the question is it's not a question of, you know, stop thinking in terms of what can I get away with.
Right. Or what's legal.
Yeah, and
That's
what's
not the
legal, yes.
issue.
I think it's the you know, the law really is an island in the sea of ethics. And it's not the answers in many of these things. But nevertheless, I think that whole process of how you view yourself with respect to those particular facilities, the resources, whether you're spending that money like it was your own. And to me, the people who are getting most problems with this are those who simply say, yeah, I can get away with it because it's happening in my organization, it's happening, other people are doing it.
Yeah.
And I think if we're only stopping ourselves when we come to the question of, is this legal, is this legally ethical, then we're missing the whole point of ethics.
That's the minimalist approach.
Right.
And what you have to do is create
That's
a whole
right.
climate of values that supports people in their individual decision making.
Right.
And I want to thank you folks for supporting us in this reflection on what is obviously a very timely and critical topic. Catherine Ray, Floyd
Happy
Brandt,
to be here.
Thank you.
blessings on you. And thank you folks for watching this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Hope you'll begin with again next week. And I'm Richard Thompson, thanking you and extending to you peace.
Good day.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.